All right, we're live. So, good morning, Michael. How you doing?
Doing well, Bill.
Yeah, good to
Excited
have
to
you
be
here.
here.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Money Talks. Bill Barhydt here. I'm really happy that this morning I'm joined by Michael Casey. I think it's Chief Content Officer. Did I get that right?
Exactly
At
correct.
CoinDesk, and we're going to talk about that. But we've got some other things I want to get into pretty quickly. We've already got people on the live stream asking lots of questions coming in. I see people from Argentina, I see Panama, I see Guatemala, I see Venezuela, I see Argentina, I see Philippines, I see Scotland. I'm literally reading it off the live stream. It's fantastic, and I'm sure we're going to have more coming on. So good morning, everybody. Welcome. Keep the questions coming. We've already got some questions. We'll get into in a minute. Michael, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, first of all, I think prolific writer, prolific speaker, as people will see here, prolific speakers, and just really interesting guy. And I was reading your weekly newsletter that you publish on CoinDesk, and you had some very interesting comments on what you see in crypto and developing markets, and I wanted to make that part of the theme for this week's AMA. And so right off the bat, I guess, what are the when you did the research for that article, what were the one or two things that just jumped out at you right away from what you
Mhm.
saw?
Yeah, so the starting point for this, I've been sort of hitting on it as a theme a little bit. The newsletter has a structure where it has a full essay, and then there are these breakout components to it that we just do small grabs. And I had just noticed, this is Matt Alberg's work. He has a site called Useful Tulips, and it collects data, amongst other things, on peer-to-peer exchanges like Paxful and local bitcoins. And he does it around the world. And he noticed this spike in activity in Africa. And you see these spikes every now and then, and it goes, but this one is really quite pronounced, and it's stayed up there. So we're
Hmm.
talking about 12 to 14 million dollars in USD transactions through those two exchanges per week now
Yep.
in Africa. Much of it driven by Nigeria.
Yep.
And so I thought that was just really interesting in itself. All of a sudden, what's going on? And I sort of just dug into it. And this is like largely a thesis. I mean, you hear from people, you
Right.
hear some stories around it, but I think it was obviously it's hard not to see it as connected to the global economic crisis connected with COVID, right?
Yeah. Sure.
One of the other, yeah, and so one of the other themes that I have been dealing with in our coverage is what's happening to the dollar, right? The
For sure.
dollar is actually in greater demand, right? I'm actually interested in the idea that we might be moving to a post-dollar sort of,
Yeah.
or at least dollar hegemonic world in some way or form. But the interim period is actually where there is a massive demand for it because of the crisis, right? And the whole world
Yep.
is more and more has become more and more dollarized around its assets.
Yep.
So the Fed throwing money at at banks. It's got swap lines with all these 16 different central banks trying to resolve the dollar shortage problem in Europe, in industrialized countries, and so forth.
Yep.
But the
Yep.
dollarization problem is a very developing world issue as well, right? Nigeria is an oil economy. It has, a lot of transactions are in dollars. I spent 6 years in Argentina. The dollar has always been an integral part of the Argentine economy. It is a dollarized economy in Venezuela. There's lots of places where the dollar is an integral part of the need for
Yep.
payments for everybody, everyday life. And if there's a shortage, what are you going to do? You're not
Right.
going to use your crappy local currency, right? And this is where Bitcoin, I think, starts to emerge as an interesting solution. If either both as a store of value against the challenge that they're facing in this environment, but potentially also as a payment vehicle. So I just dug into that, told a story about that, looked at some of the other things that I think are interesting in this space, the role that Lightning's playing, some of these
Yep.
challenges in Venezuela that are
So
leading people to microtasking and so forth.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So let's unpack a couple of things there. So let's talk about P2P in Nigeria. You mentioned. Do you think that it's a store of value investment thesis? Do you think it's a transactional? I need to pay for something, and Bitcoin is easier, or is it literally just I'd rather store money in or store my store value as Bitcoin than my local currency or gold?
Yeah, I still think it's largely store of value, but I think that I think we can be a little bit more nuanced by what we mean by that, right? So, um, talking to some folks in Venezuela around this is interesting. Yep. So it's like you need dollars in Venezuela to do stuff,
right?
But ultimately, you're still up and transacting in bolivars. So you'll be holding dollars in, not just as a kind of a speculative investment, but because you need to have that as this protective store of value for the purposes of then making a transaction, which you'll quickly transact into bolivars, avoid volatility, and get it out of there, right? Yep. So you still kind of need bolivars in many respects, right? Yep. At least for street transactions and so forth,
right?
And I think that's part of what the approach that Bitcoin offers for people in that regard. So like these guys are talking about microtasking now, and they're getting sats, they're getting satoshis from doing AI tasks on websites, and it's not really a mechanism to sort of build up a store of wealth because the amounts aren't particularly big. Although you can do things like buy cell phones through sites like Stack, which is actually popular in the Philippines as well.
Yeah.
And but I think what people are doing is gathering a little bit there, right? Shifting that over into bolivars. You can now, you've got something you can sort of play that street market game with more readily if you've got local Bitcoins and Bitcoin in it, right? So it's they're not. I don't know that people are transacting necessarily in Bitcoin yet enough. But I really think it might happen. The experience of Argentina during the crisis of 2002 is interesting here, right? Because barter markets emerged when there were not enough dollars to go around.
Right. So Argentina is always interesting to me because I think of kind of two interrelated issues and that are actually interrelated, but they are separate, right? So the first is my government issued shitcoin, right? Which invariably is going to fail, and anybody who's over the age of 50 in Argentina knows what I'm talking about. And my banking system, which is an extension of that, but has its own trust issues, even if my currency isn't in the process or isn't overtly failing in front of my eyes, and it's slowly failing, maybe by death by 1,000 cuts, like what we have in the U.S. So I think there's people who have issues with the banking system, and then there's people who have issues with their currency, and then there's the intersection of that, and just the erosion of my assets. And so I think that my take is that each country has a nuanced perspective on this, right? Like, so in India, gold is very popular. Argentina, dollars are very popular, and the premium you pay to get in and out of dollars, from what I understand in Argentina, is very significant. And people are afraid to store dollars in their bank account because they've had those dollars seized in the past, which in my mind is insane.
Dollars in Argentina are literally dollars. When you buy a house or sell a house, as I did when I was there, an apartment, I've got a whole story about it in my book about this, because it was a way to talk about many of the issues you're talking about, trust in the system. You shift a pile of cash across the table. That's what you do, right?
Yeah. One of our viewers here commented on capital controls and the need to constrain payment options domestically, and I think there's some real truth to that, right? I mean, we've seen in China, Argentina, Zimbabwe, basically capital controls are an indication that something is awry, and the government doesn't really have a lot of shit on the shelf to basically deal with the problem, right? Mm-hmm. And it's often the last bastion of a dying man is this idea of capital controls, and so to me it's a telltale sign. So interesting comment.
Yeah, the only counter to that would be like, China, of course, does capital controls. If you take the long view, as all Chinese do, I suppose, I think, you could pretty well argue that the Chinese Communist Party is a dying man, but it's a long time to die. But it is still protecting itself from this system that would that should destroy it, right? Yeah. It should destroy what it's trying to protect. Yeah.
Yep. So talk to me about this idea of you mentioned it briefly a couple of minutes ago of I think you called it micro tasks, which I mentioned in my blog or newsletter, which I thought was really interesting. I think you highlighted Venezuela as a place where this is getting traction, and maybe the Philippines. And I'd love to see some comments from anybody who's watching from those markets if you've used Stack. I think it's STAK. Is that?
Yeah, that's how
so what did you uncover in your research?
So, just, little bits and pieces here at this stage. So I'd love to hear more. Hit me up, folks. Send me more details. I think this is fascinating. So this is just an insight I got from a Venezuelan journalist called Javier Bastardo, who writes about the experience from a crypto perspective inside Venezuela. And he was saying that, yes, people are starting to stack sats through these micro tasks. Huh. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? What is it? Is it because he said it's also interesting. You can't. It's becoming more popular, not just because it's a means to obtain Bitcoin, but also because now that you can't leave your house, it's an alternative income, right? It's a way to make money from
it's like the perfect storm.
And what it is, and then I had a chat with Elizabeth from Lightning Labs, Elizabeth Stark, and she was saying that Stack is one to look at, and they're using Lightning, right? Because it has to be a low transaction impact. It can't be on chain, right? Because these are
that was one of my questions. How are you stacking sats for micro tasks if the mining fee is $3, which is where I think we were at a few days ago?
It would be impossible, right? It's pointless. But Stack uses Lightning, so this is a very early use case of Lightning.
Okay.
Yeah. So Lightning, I think the other side of the story is Lightning here. We can get to that in a minute. But what these micro tasks are a product of the giant industry that is emerging around machine learning, right? To train a computer, to train a machine learning algorithm to be as human as possible, which of course gets very scary. Let's just put all of those sort of scary stuff aside. But just if you're going to train this algorithm, it needs to get as much human intuition as possible. So when we go, and do all of those SSO sign-on things, where you're asked to check out how many traffic lights there are within the structure, right? You're feeding a machine learning. If those of you who don't know that, just be aware that you're actually doing a task as you do that. That's training a machine learning algorithm as a payment, if you like, to the site. You're not getting paid, so that's a problem.
Okay.
And ultimately, what you're doing is you're training the algorithm to figure, okay, so this is how a human being sees a traffic light. That's just a tiny piece of what machine learning needs to be. And so ultimately, if you're going to build these huge algorithms, you need people constantly to be feeding the algorithm how a human thinks or how a human sees things. And eventually you're going to have to start paying for them for that, because that other model is both unfair, and it's also just not going to give you the scope and the scale you need. Right. So that's why these sites are emerging. Microtasking is emerging as a way to get people to do things. Now you have a way to do it on a global scale in places that have capital controls, right? And you can pay them through crypto, right? Yep. So I find that fascinating, and I think it speaks to just broadly as well about what the real value of programmable money can be, right? Mm-hmm. Because it also starts to feel like it's a stream, a lightweight stream that's coming at you as you keep doing these tasks. Yes. And
well, I want to segue in a little bit into some of the things I'm seeing in the DeFi world. What people are calling the DeFi world. I'm getting more bullish on Ethereum 2.0. I was worried for a while, but it looks like things are happening, and things like DAI that seem to be working. So we've had some comments from some viewers who in the Philippines are using apps like Abra to basically do those P2P transfers, because Abra is actually the custodian, so obviously moving Bitcoin around in that case is free because you're not actually leaving the Abra network, but you can still withdraw the Bitcoin to a hardware wallet. So we have lots of people on the stream now who actually use a combination of Abra for their P2P transactions. Go to retail, 7-Eleven, Tambunting, those of you in the Philippines know what I'm talking about, or even their Union Bank account, for example, to get in and out via fiat and crypto, but then once they're in the network are doing free P2P transactions, but can easily withdraw to their hardware wallet, once every few months when they need to make a large deposit or a large withdrawal. So that's exciting.
How much of that is happening? Have P2P transactions? How is it? And are you seeing growth in that kind of?
We are. I mean, look, we don't really market P2P. It's really interesting because this is something that our user base has figured out. Meaning, if you're in the Abra app, and I think I've sent you money in Abra before, you just literally go to send money, and you type in the phone number of the recipient, who can be either in the Philippines or in the U.S. or in any other country in the world, and they receive the appropriate currency. If we support their local currency, it's probably converted, and if not, it's probably using some stablecoin, True USD, Tether, or DAI, or whatever. So we have users who figure that out.
Yeah.
And that's great, and that's a real volume in our system. We obviously don't make money on that, and that's totally fine. And then we have lots of users who tell us in the Philippines that they're using Abra for both as a store of value, e-gold type of replacement, as well as a P2P system. And if there's anybody here who has any stories about that, would love to hear about it as well. Let's see, we've got some other comments and questions. Wow, Singapore, Sri Lanka. Welcome everyone. It's fantastic. Probably, certainly the most in Zimbabwe. It's certainly the most international audience we've seen. So that's great to see.
Right.
The other thing you mentioned that I wanted to ask you before we get back. There's a question here I want to follow up on, but you mentioned I just mentioned stablecoins. You mentioned stablecoin adoption in Latin America, and I think Ripio, who we both know and love, had mentioned something like 10x growth in stablecoin adoption in the first quarter. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the numbers that Sebastian Serrano gave me from the CEO there at Ripio.
What was driving that? Did he have a specific reason? Like, could he articulate why?
I think we can just hypothesize, right,
Sure.
that it may well be these breakdowns. And what's interesting as well, this is the first quarter, so the most heavy impact of the crisis.
It hadn't
really,
hit.
I think,
Right.
Had hit,
Wow.
Right. But I do think that this is where canary in the coal mine stuff gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because there really was an emerging stress in the global. We just saw that the timekeepers of the U.S. recessions actually put the start of the U.S. recession in February, right?
Yep.
So the world was already going into a state of stress.
Yeah.
China's supply chains were shutting down, and China, I think, has been a much more engaged market participant in these emerging markets than the US. So what we were seeing here probably was not necessarily capturing what was already impacting in Latin America and Africa, this serious Chinese slowdown. And therefore, dollar shortages, just economic stress, right? The financial system starting to feel really funky. There were emerging market currencies that were already going through crises and challenges before this. Argentina in particular was having a really hard time. So inevitably, it gets back to what we were talking about as well. What are you going to do? How are you going to just literally day-to-day move money around? And it coincides with the emergence of these stablecoins. And so they've got DAI on there, and I think USDC, I think he said.
Yep.
So one, the Ethereum-based token, the other one being, of course, the virtual algorithmic currency of DAI, right?
Right.
And yes, I mean, and then to me, this makes. I've written about stablecoin growth during the crisis as well. Again, I think because of this dollar shortage, you've seen USDC has seen significant interest in their four business services that they've rolled out among just no longer just crypto exchanges and typical crypto players.
Yeah. It's almost like, but it's almost like the ultimate bank account, right? Because somebody made the comment that it was his name Joshua made the comment online that with cheap Android phones, right, $50, $75, you can basically use something like Abra and stablecoins, and you have effectively a free bank account that works in any country in the world. If all you're doing is moving stablecoins in, nobody needs to know who you are. If you want to use the banking system, there's normal KYC or a credit card or whatever, normal KYC.
On me for a moment there.
Oh, okay. So I don't know
what our viewers are going to be seeing in that regard.
The stream goes directly out, so I think if you didn't hear me, they heard me. I was basically talking about stablecoins and this idea that that stablecoins really represent, combined with crypto, the ultimate bank account, right? And so to me, it's this idea that you can get a $50 phone anywhere in the world, put an app like Abra on your phone, all of a sudden you have TrueUSD, Tether, whatever you want. You can move in and out of crypto. You can send crypto directly to whoever you want, and you're off to the races. So it's a huge breakthrough in what we've always dreamed of for financial inclusion.
Yeah. I mean, this is what got me into this space in the first place. As I said, spent 6.5 years in Argentina. I've done a lot of writing about Latin America and its challenges. Got interested in property rights and questions around that.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about that. Yep.
Right, and so all of this stuff became. That was it. That was the thing. It wasn't until I realized that there was a financial inclusion aspect to this I suddenly got really interested. Then all the other stuff, the rabbit hole that you go down on crypto becomes just bigger and bigger, of course. But I mean, that was always it. And so seeing it start to emerge in this way is really exciting because it's also the organic aspect of it, right? It's like that people are just figuring out. You mentioned your own customers just figuring out they can do P2P without Abra. The fact that Ripio out of nowhere, suddenly they get 10x increase in demand, so people are seeing these opportunities. The conversation is growing. I think what's going to be very interesting though is you could say a battle of the stable coins, right? Let's just let anybody who doesn't think we're not moving to a digital framework for money itself is bonkers, right?
Yeah.
We absolutely are going there. And by the way, a digital bank account is not digital money. Let's just put that aside. Money itself it might be interfacing with the banking system as a lot
right.
of,
I think that's a big distinction. Yeah.
Yes, but the reserve bank models, the USDCs and so forth, Tether and that is an interface with the banking system.
Right.
But but you're treating the digital unit as a kind of digital bearer instrument, right? It doesn't need bank approval. You're not getting processed through the centralized ledger of the banks. You're literally just trading this token that resists on top of it.
Yeah.
However, the fact that you've got these different ways to define what that token is a really critical question. If we go way out and say, okay, what does the world actually need? Do we want the regulatory framework of a banking system to give us the confidence we need to trade, say, USDC, or is that going to be yet another friction point and leaving us vulnerable to the failures of a banking system, right? So one of the arguments why people are interested in USDC and these other ones is that there's you're kind of able to trade something that doesn't give you're not exposed to the fractional reserve banking system, but in some respects, a lot of those reserves are still being held in FDIC banks. So FDIC insured banks, which it's got the insurance behind it, but it's still got that fractional problem. If those funds get put into some different assets that they're holding, treasury bills or so forth, then maybe you are removing it. Nonetheless, you're still kind of dependent upon the U.S. government. There's still an attachment to that old, analog world. Whereas DAI, of course, it's a much more it's algorithmic. It's a synthetic concept,
right?
Built around the collateral adjustments that get built into the system.
Right. DAI is fascinating for sure.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
The one thing I worry about it though is as much as it's growing, I don't know what it looks like in a massively stress tested environment.
That's right.
Whether or not algos could just game it and ultimately break it in the same way that the CDOs broke in the 2008 crisis, right? I see a little bit of that, this hyper collateralization problem there.
Right.
But then the other, of course, a third before we get to the other one is of course, you could just have the central bank issue a digital currency, which is lots of them are doing that right now. So they're competing. That's the third model. And I think the Abra model that you guys, started with is a fourth version of this.
Yep.
And interestingly, there is a project now coming out of Venezuela that in some respects looks like Abra called Value, VALIU, that I mentioned in my piece. And it's this idea of the synthetic currency built upon using something like Bitcoin as the rails underneath it, and then contracts for difference and the like, being in the middle of settling that and just using the settlement rail. And interestingly, the guys who went for the value model said that they felt like the most important thing was to have the liquidity of the Bitcoin settlement network to be the foundation upon which they could then kind of guarantee the capacity to move those funds around. So you've got all these competing value propositions and all these different pros and cons of it all. So stablecoins, I think, are going to be a really interesting battleground.
Really exciting time for all of that. All right, so I've got a whole stream of questions and comments here. Let me process a few of these, and then I want to come back to Ethereum and DeFi. So I'll do last in, first out. So Wayne, do you have what we call interest if I put money or crypto into Abra? So Wayne, excellent question. All I can say there is stay tuned. I can't give all of our secrets away except to say this is something that I think you'll enjoy our upcoming announcement on if you're interested in earning interest on Abra deposits. Talim asked me, Bill, if I have a site that accepts Bitcoin, how do I pay using Abra? So all you're going to do is do in the Abra app, press withdraw, and you can withdraw Bitcoin, and you basically paste in the address of the site. It looks like you're trying to buy silver. They'll give you a Bitcoin address, and you simply paste that into the withdraw function in the Abra app. Paul asked about remittances. I want to come back to that, Paul, because that's a long conversation, and I want to get Mike's take on that. So let me come back to that in 1 second. Jordan had a comment on, wouldn't cryptocurrencies being taxable as capital gains make it monetized, not demonetized? He said, I mean, you have to claim it on your yearly taxes now. Where is that leading? So I give you my take. Mike, would love to get your take as well. But I think that I think governments have always made a distinction between, for example, small dollar FX. If you travel from the U.S. to the U.K. and you're getting a benefit of forex, they're obviously not going to tax that. But if you're doing a massive investment in pounds and you make money on that, there's obviously going to be taxes. I think crypto is more or less moving in the same direction. Meaning, if you're using a stablecoin as a means of a P2P transaction, you'll pay whatever sales or VATs you have to in the local market. But you're probably not going to be taxed on any kind of capital gains unless you're actually using it for speculative purposes. And we're seeing a bifurcation even in the U.S. now, where nobody seems to be focusing on, if I'm using $100 in crypto, am I paying capital gains on that? It's really the large amounts. And I think there's even guidelines from the IRS on that, and I'm sure other countries have done the same. But let's talk about this remittance question. The user was specifically asking if we're seeing a significant volume of remittances flowing through the Abra system. We see a lot of users doing P2P transactions. There's no difference in the Abra system in sending money from one user in the Philippines to another user in the Philippines, or sending money from the US to the Philippines. It all works the same way in our system. It basically just uses simple crypto rails to move the money around, and basically just works through our exchange partners, and it's all transparent to you. So you can send a dollar stablecoin in the US, and somebody can, for example, receive a peso stablecoin in the Philippines in their Abra app. I mean, I've also heard anecdotal evidence. I don't know if you've seen this, Mike, that in Mexico, XRP is getting a lot of traction in remittances. Did you happen to notice any of that in your research? I've seen some claims on pretty significant volume, and I can't tell how much of that is real, how much of that is just kind of wash trading that's artificially using XRP or other currencies. Do you have a feel for that?
I don't. I've heard similar stories.
Yeah.
And look, I think it's interesting that you find different platforms, different crypto solutions gaining traction in these different marketplaces, right? Mexico maybe XRP, and other places are using DAI, and there's it's interesting. I have no reason to doubt those stories other than
I'm gonna investigate the Mexican thing and try to write about it in the next couple of weeks, because I keep hearing anecdotal evidence, but I haven't seen the proof yet. But if it's happening, it's very interesting, and I think also for Ripple in particular, a very interesting use case. Somebody mentioned, Wayne mentioned a comment that the last time he checked that the Zimbabwe Reserve Bank wasn't allowing Bitcoin, which made it hard for us to understand. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think there's a distinction between governments allowing people to store their own Bitcoin. I've yet to see a government which says you can't store your own Bitcoin as ones and zeros on your own hard disk or in your own wallet. And some governments say we don't want local banks to transact for people to buy and sell Bitcoin. And we're seeing some of that, but even less and less. So in India, for example, RBI basically came out and said, hey, banks are not allowed to support certain types of businesses, including Bitcoin exchanges. And they ended up having to do reverse that completely, did a 180 on that when the Supreme Court said, hey, you're artificially blocking people from doing something they want to do, which is perfectly legal, and that's to buy and sell Bitcoin. And so now the banks are starting to open up in India, which I think is a fantastic example of what we're going to see around the world, that people are going to get what they want. If people want to be able to buy and sell Bitcoin from their bank account in their home country, eventually the governments are going to have to back down, and allow them to do it. I'm getting a bunch of questions on taxes and crypto. I think that if you go to abra.com, abra.com, I think we have a section on there that talks about this in our blog site. I'm not a tax expert, and people are asking me, is there government oversight if I do transactions? Look, so let me just be clear. Mike and I are not tax experts. We're not here to give tax advice. But I will tell you that, generally speaking, if you are buying Bitcoin as a taxable investment or as an investment in the United States, you're going to have to pay capital gains above a certain threshold. And so you should talk to your tax lawyer, look in your tax software, et cetera, et cetera. But do your own homework on that. And we'll also, if you send an email to support@abra.com, we can also send you in the right direction. But abra.com has a lot of resources, on the basics here. Is it true that China seized Bitcoin? I think every government, when they see nefarious use of, or people breaking the law, has a history now of seizing Bitcoin. I don't think governments, I haven't heard any stories of governments seizing Bitcoin for the sake of seizing Bitcoin. But I've seen lots of stories of people breaking the law or local law, and as a result having Bitcoin seized, whether it's Silk Road or illegal P2P trading in countries that unfortunately regulate that. But I don't know if you've seen anything like that, Mike. But where they've just arbitrarily seized.
You see things like mining equipment being seized and that sort of stuff in Venezuela. So it's coming at it from that's illegal use of electricity, whatever that they can get you on. I think that's become a problem. Yep. I think Venezuela's been a very interesting story for how the government has treated Bitcoin in that sense. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. We've got some other comments. This is great, guys. Just keep them coming. So let's see.
Can I pick up on the whole, where I think we've seen these waves over time, right, of governments being draconian and then pulling back.
Yeah.
And you recognize it's like, holding back the tide. You literally can't sort of control it. But also I think and this is again hypothetical. We're not in this situation right now. For the time being, we do know that most central banks are very, very keen to maintain the integrity of their own control over their monetary policy. Mm-hmm. But in places where you see complete breakdown, and I'm not.
You mean like Seattle, for example?
So, like, what's right?
I don't know if you see what's going on in Seattle right now. It's incredible.
Right. Well, there you go. That's a complete breakdown. Yeah. Seattle may well be the test case for all of this.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, when you have law and order, everything's gone, right? I mean, right. So Venezuela, it still has very much of a dictatorship control, but they did have to completely give up. Like, Nicolas Maduro still talks about the dollar as this horrible, evil, satanic thing. But once the Bolivar had sort of collapsed to this ridiculous level of value and there was hyperinflation out of control, you literally couldn't have your economy function without having dollars in there. And now the question is, you literally cannot function without some sort of crypto solution in the middle of it, right? So yep. I wouldn't, and this is not to wish upon the world like all this chaos, but like there are sort of plumbing problems that come with the structure of the global banking dollar-based financial system that may well drive places that would never have thought about being pro-crypto to just say, look, we have to do this now, right? Like, it may be that, you've got central banks that would say, yeah, we could think of building a stable coin on the back of some other crypto rail because that's the fastest way for us to build out a system, for example, right? And I do think it's necessity. You need a medium of exchange to exist as a country and as a government. And so I just think these are really interesting times for this, and I think the most innovative governments out there may actually recognize opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise have expected them to do.
Yeah. So people are asking what's happening in Seattle. So for those of you who haven't seen what's going on there lately, apparently first of all, the police station in a certain part of the city has been abandoned, from what I understand. And a group of apparently peaceful protesters literally cornered off several city blocks and established what they call Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ or Chaz. I don't know if they're calling it that. Now Trump, of course, is referring to them as ugly anarchists and domestic terrorists. I don't know, how he all of a sudden assumes that they're terrorists when I'm not hearing of any violence or any threats to violence. But I don't know why the police abandoned the station and allowed the people to do what they're doing. But I am hearing also, on the other side, I am hearing some stories of people who have the guns, having some mafia tactics and demanding money from other people for protection, which is concerning. But nobody really knows how this is going to play out. I mean, in my life, I've never seen anything like this in the United States. Now, interesting, back to relating this to money, I've seen stories of almost Burning Man where people are giving things away and trades and doing stuff where there's literally no paper money involved. And I've also heard of street vendors selling hot dogs and hamburgers for $7-8 using cash. So if they really want to establish an autonomous zone, I'm wondering if we're eventually going to see some Bitcoin transactions and people bypassing the U.S. dollar. But again, as I said, I mean, this is uncharted territory for the United States. I can't remember ever having seen or heard anything like this. I mean, it's absolutely insane what's going on.
Yeah, and it's also germane to the crypto world in the sense that it is this removal of centralized power, and it's a test around some of the ideas that lots of folks in this community are interested in. Fact, and it's hard. I think it's very hard to assess even where it's going, but ultimately. There'll be all sorts of interesting academic papers written about it at the very least. We'll see.
Yep. Okay, so a bunch of comments coming in. I want to segue into DeFi in a second. So let me. There were some questions about DeFi as well. Will Abra users be able to buy U.S. stocks once again, as in the past? Rav, we're looking into that. It's very complex legally. It's something that we definitely want to be able to do. I have no announcements about Abra doing that, but it's something that we would like to be able to eventually offer. But unfortunately, right now, it's something that's going to have to wait, just given the legal complexities. Let's see, another question here. Let's see, I need a trusted side to trade. I've come across a lot of scammers who are using Abra to transfer funds in their accounts. Is there a way to report them? Any nefarious use you see in the crypto world, you can always send an email to support@abra.com. Even if it's not on Abra, you can tell us, and if there's a way we can help you, we'll certainly let you know. Be very careful. If you're basically doing P2P trades in your home country, be very careful. Make sure you know who you're dealing with, and start with small amounts if you're going to do it. And use trusted services like Paxful and other services if you're going to enter into those type of transactions. If you're in the Philippines, I strongly encourage you to use services like Abra directly, where you can go to 7-Eleven and Tambunting to do P2P transactions. I have another question here from Rainier. What's our take on? And I want to segue after this into DeFi. So the last, what's your take on the SEC barring the launch of the Telegram Open Network blockchain and the ongoing case against Kik? Will this be an issue for the future of crypto? So I don't think the SEC barred the launch. I think it's more complex than that. I think there was a court case, and eventually, Telegram had to back down, and it wasn't worth fighting. And my understanding is that they're returning some percentage, like 70% of the money or something like that. And then of course there's this ongoing case against Kick, where I think the accusation is that there was an illegal security offering, and will that be an issue for the future of crypto? I would say it's already an issue for the future of the present of crypto, and is likely to be an issue for the future of crypto. I think that one of the biggest issues with these crypto-based or blockchain-based tokens is that they expose this issue between 1940s regulation and 2020, which is, in 1950, it was very clear that if you created a contract to issue securities in the United States, that the paper, the lawyers, the people, the buyers, the banks, they were all in the United States. And there was no misunderstanding that this was a US-based offering of securities. Now we have this technology that basically is global out of the gate, right? And in theory, I don't even have to touch the banking system to issue a token, which the US government might deem a security, but 100 other governments might say is not a security. And so the question then becomes, which laws apply, if any, and why? And so the US government, for example, is clearly coming out, or I shouldn't say the US government, the SEC specifically, is clearly coming out on the side that they have the ability and the right to oversee anything that's happening globally that might touch the United States. Now, a lot of our viewers outside the US say, well, that's crazy talk. Well, you can call it whatever you want, that's what's happening, okay? And until they get legislative direction otherwise, that's going to remain the case. And it is what it is. We can all complain, bitch and moan, it doesn't matter. That's the way they see it. I think Kick is a case in point, Telegram's a case in point. I can tell you I've had a lot of interactions with regulators on this issue, but when it comes to extraterritorial application of US law, I think it's going to get quote unquote worse, not better. So that's my answer as it relates to the SEC.
I'll jump in on this, Bill.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, just as well to plug this week's newsletter. Just so you guys know, the newsletter that Bill was referring to before is called Money Reimagined. It comes out every Friday. You can subscribe to it. It's free, obviously. If you go to CoinDesk.com and you'll find, if you scroll down the bottom, you'll find a sign-up sheet for newsletters in there. So mine's called Money Reimagined. We have a number of other newsletters as well. So in this week's Money Reimagined newsletter, I'm actually looking at the madness in the US stock market and making some points about the broken functionality of our capital allocation system that represents, right? So the Fed, as we know, QE infinity, is throwing money to try to resolve this dollar shortage challenge, this sort of the crisis that comes from the economic problems of COVID-19, and it's led to the biggest 50-day rally we've ever seen, which is crazy, right? In the midst of, as the US was hitting 100,000 deaths from COVID, and as the whole Black Lives Matter protest movement put huge challenges into big questions about the structure of how we govern these things, and was essentially creating, something of a political crisis, right?
Yep.
There's this moment of dysfunction, and here's the stock market soaring, and the thing is, that is the vehicle by which capital then gets raised, right? If the price is high, you can borrow at better rates. Our stock price is this critical bellwether, but it's an elite group. It's just publicly listed companies that are in that space, and they're working on a quarterly basis, trying to meet their quarterly goals. They are not inherently innovative, right? I mean, there are of course lots of tech companies that get listed, but innovation is something that has to happen without that burden of the quarterly goal you have to meet. So you're all mature, right? Hertz, it literally went into bankruptcy, has soared. It then fell because it looks like the MASC is going to delist it. But it soared for 3 days, a 574% rally.
Wow.
And it's bankrupt because of just this speculation that is in itself being bred by the whole sort of Fed stimulus effort. So now you've got our capital allocation model handing money to a bankrupt car rental company, as opposed to figuring out ways to distribute funds to startups, to innovators, to people who are going to build the solutions to the problem. So that's where the ICO, the ICO model was deeply flawed. I mean, there was so many scams and hype and everything else. So I'm not defending the way it was managed, But some of the core, and this is what the newsletter is all about, some of the core principles that were being discussed at that time were all about how do we create an ideas market? How do we create an environment which not only can, retail investors who don't have access to the privileged returns of venture capitalists get some access to that, and how do startups who don't have to just knock on every door in Sand Hill Road and play a kind of a game with all of these gatekeepers, how do they gain access to a wider market so that we can actually flow money to the innovators who are building things? We need to have that conversation. That conversation really does need to happen. And whether it's ICOs or STOs or some hybrid of that, or just, reforms to the Jobs Act, anything that can help to bring more funding and, allocate funding away from these, deadbeat smokestack companies to innovators is really critical. Anyway,
I also think there's a huge disconnect between there's a lot of tweens that are basically using apps like Robinhood and others to buy stocks right now, and there's a massive disconnect between the reality of what people think the Fed is doing. Like, I've had people tell me, well, the Fed is buying stocks, and so they're the buyer of last resort. I said, the Fed is not buying stocks, right? If they're buying ETFs, it's bond ETFs. The Fed is propping up the debt markets right now. And as a result, that's pumping more money into the system. It's unclear that money is going to land in the pockets of the average consumer to create a floor in discounted cash flows, which means the price of stocks ultimately. And so I'm worried that people are underestimating the 1 + 1 is 2, which is, hey, probably 40% global unemployment, if not more. Underreported massively in the U.S. Minority communities are being hit unbelievably hard. We don't know the impact of the second wave. We don't know the impact even of the protests, which I fully support. I wrote about this in the article. But on the other hand, we don't know how those protests of people gathering, in the same place are going to impact the second and third wave of COVID. I hope there's no impact, but that may be wishful thinking, and so I think that there's a major disconnect right now between people's perception of what you call QE infinity and what's happening in equities. And so I have no crystal ball, but I think like I said, major disconnect. Okay, so
be very wary.
So DeFi. Absolutely. So, all right. So, last topic. I want to talk about what we're seeing in DeFi. You mentioned DAI earlier. I've got a whole bunch of questions here on the future of DeFi. So let's kind of break it down for people. I know you guys just had your consensus conference. I know there was a lot of talk about DeFi and the future of Ethereum there. What's your take on where this is going and why?
Right. So I also I think I like to think even bigger than just say make a DAO and DeFi as we think of it in this isolated thing with DAI. I think what it is creating is this capacity to reimagine the a synthetic blockchain based collateral and lending architecture for the future of finance. And so I think they're going to be varying degrees, right? This is a fully algorithmic system. It's supposed to be sort of self-correcting and so forth. And now you're watching the way that the foundation has worked to try to bring some more security. Interest rates spike at different times, gets really difficult. They're bringing in some stablecoin assets on top of that collateral environment,
right?
Which may give more security. It might also mean you end up like hyper collateralizing and creating down the road problems. I just don't know, but I nonetheless think that within that structure, you've now got ideas of people saying, all right, the really interesting thing here is the capacity for a smart contract to execute a margin call, right? Which is as you would know, you've been in finance for a long time, is this integral part of how lending happens in the securities market. And it's automated, but it's still very legal and clunky, right? You get a call, you have to pay up because the price of the collateral you posted is now less. So, and there's this whole, theory that emerged in 2008 around the collateral cycle as being this pro-cyclical problem, so that price goes down, bank demands that you pay up to cover that fall in the collateral. That then requires you to sell some other asset to obtain those funds. That drives down the price of that asset,
right?
Which then somebody else. And so you create this systemic problems,
yeah.
right? Now, the risk is that DeFi creates a whole sort of hyper version of that. On the other hand, the other way to think about it is like, well, because smart contracts can do this in a way that neither of us can control, you're at least removing these very real friction problems that come from lawyers, that come from the bankers who sit in the middle of it, from all these kind of things. It's neither you or I have got control over how that collateral is going to be handled. So you're removing all that counterparty risk aspect to that. It may be, and I'm just saying maybe because it could go the other way, right? It could just be hyper collateralized problems. It may be the opposite, that in fact, because we remove that friction, the system actually gets back into equilibrium more readily.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in that. I'm also interested in the idea that Bitcoin becomes a normal collateral asset for anybody anywhere.
Right. That was a question actually on the stream here is do we see Bitcoin becoming a key component of DeFi solutions in the future? Whereas right now, as we all know, if you think about DAI or the DAO or Compound or even what Abra's done, anything traditionally in the DeFi right now is for the most part Ethereum based.
Yeah.
But in theory,
you have these Bitcoin based smart contracts, ERC20
right.
Token, right? That
right.
exist on top of Ethereum,
right.
denominated in Bitcoin.
Right.
For this purpose.
Right, but on the flip side, the closest I've seen to being able to use Bitcoin directly without having to create tokenized Bitcoin is what RSK is doing, and I think, but even there, I think we're going to see a bifurcation where Ethereum and 2.0, which I wrote about, and if you haven't really looked into what's coming with Ethereum 2.0, it's really exciting to me. It really becomes the world's computer if Ethereum 2.0 works, and really delivers on the promise of software eating the world as it relates to money and banking. Bitcoin was the first system that said, okay, software can eat the world as it relates to money. And as we said earlier, I kind of look at this as a bifurcated issue of in developing markets in particular of, do I trust my government to create money? And do I trust the banks, regardless of whether I trust the money, right? And so, the 1.0 of crypto was Bitcoin basically could become a financial asset. And if you believe in the stock to flow model, Bitcoin's on its way to becoming finally a financial asset. And now with Ethereum 2.0, I think that we finally have a platform that could potentially deliver on the process, on the potential of a global computer to create smart contracts, to create DAI currencies, create stable coins that scale to $1 trillion potentially in transaction volume, to create smart contracts that don't require potentially even a centralized oracle, which is the kind of weak link in the DeFi chain today. So I'm really bullish on the promise of Ethereum 2.0. There's been a lot of delays, and if it delivers, the delays are obviously worth it. But I don't know your thoughts, if you agree or disagree.
I've become a little skeptical because of all the delays, but I mean,
right.
The signaling we're hearing from Vitalik and others is pretty upbeat right now. He was one of the first interviews we did. I was at the opening session at Consensus, and I specifically asked him, is it coming? We were here. July was the date, and he misheard and said yes in July.
Uh-oh.
So that's what he then corrected himself. He recognized it. I think there's certainly. I'm hearing more positive responses now than I've ever heard. It does feel as if it might get there. And yes, I mean, if they pull it off, it'll be huge. I think that the transition from proof of work to staking is. We don't know.
We don't know.
That's just don't know what that means, right? I mean,
right.
And is there going to be? How do we deal with losses that come from that? I also think and I haven't looked enough into what 2.0 is doing in terms of building kind of decentralization checks in there. But I mean, I sometimes worry that a staking model creates, new fiefdoms of control. The sort of, how democratic it is, how representative, how decentralized it is. But I know there's a lot of really sophisticated solutions that these guys are looking at. I'm always just believe that the vision behind Ethereum is something to be marveled at. Right? Yeah. I mean, we kind of need these big dreams, and I think they get away from the world. They did get away from the world computer language a bit because it just seems so preposterous that you would say something on those terms. But I actually kind of liked it because I think one of the most exciting things about crypto generally for me was that it was a space in which people who had really big ideas were actually given a chance to run with it, and they would get funding and they would go and do it. And the fact that Ethereum has continued is really impressive. They've got, and the relationships they have on a corporate levels now. I mean, the Ethereum Alliance, a lot of these are sort of obviously private versions of Ethereum, but nonetheless, there's this legitimacy to the project.
Yeah. I think people are underestimating.
Do not sufficiently recognize.
Absolutely not. I totally agree with that. I think people are underestimating, particularly a lot of our peers in the Bitcoin community who are just very bearish on Ethereum. I think that it's a little bit of just a like overly defensive posture that Ethereum is not trying to be the digital gold, and it never was, right? And so if you accept the fact that it is trying to be a virtual machine for code execution in Nick Szabo's smart contract model, it's unbelievably compelling, and it's working, right? I mean, just the sheer amount of stablecoins that get moved around via this model proves that it's working incredibly well, even in its 1.0 state. So I was just to say, so to that end, a lot of people are asking, how can I basically, I'm all in on Bitcoin, I want to learn more about Ethereum and other cryptos. So we have a section on Abra.com which talks about more generic crypto investing. You can download the Abra app, and you can actually try moving Bitcoin in between other cryptocurrencies. The app supports dozens of cryptos. But there's also a section on our website on Abra.com where we dig into other cryptocurrencies. We have probably 20 interviews with people from myriad cryptocurrency projects, including Vitalik and folks from Tron and Stellar and EOS and other projects. And so you can look all those up on Abra.com. Will Abra be offering similar services to MCO or Coinbase with investing and debit cards? I'm not really sure I understand the question. You can use a credit card on Abra today. If you're in the US, I would strongly encourage you to use your bank account instead of a credit card because the fees are quite high. But if you're outside the US and you're stuck, credit card will always work. And let's see. I think, so somebody finally noticed it. Mike and I were talking before the show if anybody was going to notice the Shay painting behind you. So maybe you want to comment on that. So
I'm going to Shay Cola.
Christian is our winner, by the way. I
have a Shay duct tape. I have a Shay comb. Why do I have all this stuff?
Lest people think you're a closet communist, you might want to provide some context.
It's called Che's Afterlife, and it's all about the commercialization of the image. Now, the image of Che, the famous photo of Corda by Alberto Corda, became this phenomenon that took over the world and actually turned Che, a communist, essentially into a capitalist. And it's a conversation, the book's a conversation about that aspect of it. It's neither left or right wing. It's a discussion around, I'm just fascinated by it as a phenomenon, as a cultural phenomenon, as a meme. It's one of the greatest memes of history. And that's what I'm all about. So this is just fun. I live in this little cave, and in my cave, I even have a Che Guevara.
Oh God! All right, well, we're definitely. Oh, come on, you gotta end leaving that on. I mean, anyway. So look, so we're running on an hour. It's 10 a.m. Pacific. So we'll stop there. I'm excited about this. This obviously will be up on the Abra YouTube channel right away for people who didn't make it live. Really very grateful to the folks that joined from all over the world, also in the middle of the night. This is not a convenient time for a lot of folks joining from Asia, even or Eastern Europe, whatnot. And so we're very grateful that you either gave us your Friday evening, if you're in that time zone, or in the middle of the night on Saturday morning. And as Joshua says, capitalism always works. So we agree. And thanks again, everyone. I think I counted about 25 countries. So that's great. Let's see if we can do even better next time. But Michael Casey, so people can best follow you and find more about your work where?
Well, of course, at CoinDesk, search on the author name. I think it's listed under Mike J. Casey there.
Yep.
I also have my own website that doesn't get updated nearly as regularly as it should be, michaeljcasey.com. But you will find information about the various books that I've written there and so forth. Follow me on Twitter. Mike J. Casey is the Twitter handle. That sort of thing. But CoinDesk, please go to CoinDesk. CoinDesk is where it's all at. Weekly newsletter, Money Reimagined. Sign up for that. Get the newsletter into your email, all free. And sign up for all the other ones we have as well. Lots of great content, as I'm sure many of you know.
Fantastic. So we'll leave it at that. Download Abra, abra.com. Keep the questions coming. You can also follow up. If we didn't get to your question here and you want to ask, you can also respond on Twitter or Facebook, or send an email to hello@abra.com, and myself or the team we all read those emails, and we're happy to respond. So we'll see you next week. But in the meantime, great to see everyone. Thanks for the questions, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, everyone.